and welcome to the panel Race Matters, examining the workings of race and gender in the UN human rights system. My name is Dipika Nath. I'm a gender and sexuality rights activist, and I teach high school literature and politics, and I'll be moderating today's conversation. First, some logistics. We have interpretation in Spanish and French, and captioning in English, Spanish, and French. To select the language of your preference, click Interpretation, the world icon, from your control panel below. Then click the language that you'd like to hear. Once you've selected your language, and if it isn't English, we suggest you click on the interpretation icon again and select Mute Original Audio from the same menu so you can hear the interpreters clearly. To turn on English captions, click Closed Captions in the controls at the top of your screen. You'll see the captioning on the bottom of your screen. If you need to adjust the caption size, click on the arrow next to Stop Start Video and choose Video Settings. Click on Accessibility and move the slider to adjust the caption size. For captions in Spanish and French, please copy and paste the links that will be provided in the chat box. Let me briefly introduce the panelists in the order in which they will speak. Pooja Badarinath is the Advocacy Advisor on Special Procedures and Knowledge Translation for the Sexual Rights Initiative. Pooja is from India and has worked on law and policy implementation and reform on gender-based violence and sexuality and accountability for violations at national and regional levels. She's committed to feminist ways of working and exploring the idea of international human rights spaces as sites for feminist analysis for activists from the global south. She has a keen interest in understanding the relationship between law and sexuality and the ways in which they interact with each other. Tlaleng Mofokeng is a medical doctor living in Johannesburg. She's been a sexual and reproductive health and rights consultant, a broadcaster, and is the author of Dr. T, A Guide to Sexual Health and Pleasure. At the 44th session of the Human Rights Council, she was appointed the United Nations Special Rapporteur on the Right to Health. Vereen A. Shepherd, host of Talking History on Nationwide 90 FM, is a social historian, a vice chair of the United Nations Committee on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination, director of the Center for Reparation Research, and the immediate past university director of the Institute for Gender and Development Studies at the University of the West Indies. She spent 5 years as a member of the UN's Working Group of Experts on People of African Descent, and 2 as chair of it. Dominique is the chair of the UN Working Group of Experts on People of African Descent, a fact-finding body mandated by the UN Human Rights Council to investigate and report on the situation of people of African descent globally. She's a human rights attorney who also leads Daylight, an Access to Justice platform. Internationally, her policy and capacity building work focuses heavily on racial justice. She has extensive criminal and civil litigation experience on behalf of individuals and communities within the Black diaspora, including in post-conflict bachelor's degree from Harvard University and a Juris Doctor from Stanford Law School. We have a powerful panel here, and I'd like to briefly sketch the contours of today's conversation before turning it over to them. The history of race is always the history of gender, and vice versa. The epistemological foundation, as well as everyday experience of this truth, is by now too well established to need rehearsing. And yet, and here's our first paradox, law, public policy, health measures, institutional structures, pedagogical initiatives, funding streams, consistently ignore the inter-implication of these organizing logics. These socially constructed and mutually enabling categories of race and gender nevertheless yield very real and material consequences for feminized and racialized people. These are the people who bear closest witness to environmental destruction, endless wars, crushing poverty, everyday humiliations, and a near total erasure from Western history, literature, philosophy, and politics, even as their labor serves as the foundation upon which societies rest. And yet the concept of intersectionality, as articulated by Black feminists, and which offers tools for thinking about these questions clearly, often devolves into identity politics by another name, including in UN spaces, as debates on how to further LGBT rights, for example, often demonstrate. So the first problem is about conceptualizing the problem itself, and each of the panelists will shed more light on this. Another paradox concerns the sacrifice of the real at the altar of so-called realistic or pragmatic politics. This means that, at least in large NGOs and multilateral spaces, we acknowledge the intertwined nature of oppressions, but still shy away from formulating our programmatic and even our conceptual work in a way that responds to the needs of the most oppressed. In other words, it is considered unrealistic to address the real problems that people face. And we paper over this contradiction by speaking about trickle-down effects, incremental gains, progressive realization, and by counseling the disenfranchised in habits of patience, resilience, adaptation, and a can-do attitude, all buzzwords of neoliberal capitalism. The bodies of Black, Indigenous, and people of color have always been at white capital's disposal and have always been simultaneously gendered, racialized, and sexualized, using logics that have ultimately supported the accumulation of wealth by a few, even as these logics have been internally incoherent. Colonizers who arrived in today's South Africa documented the peculiar sexual mores of the Khoi and the San, including the fact that these communities did not appear to, quote, distinguish between the sexes, and used this as evidence of their incomplete or insufficient humanity. Colonizers in South Asia bemoaned the segregation of the sexes, which was evidence of Asian distance from proper civilized behavior. Black enslaved women were exempt from any demands of normative femininity and worked under the same conditions as Black men, though this did not prevent them from being raped for profit, even as white women were forced to embrace a fragile femininity that rested on Black labor. These same ideas of femininity predicated upon a narrow beauty ideal are now used to police the bodies of Black, Indigenous, and women of color. And righteous claims about gender equality are used to justify wars. These seeming contradictions should alert us to what is really at stake, not shifting ideas of so-called proper femininity and masculinity per se, but the cynical and profiteering spirit with which these are manipulated to suit capital accumulation at different historical moments. Therefore, a third problem is the delinking of the present from the past. Knowledge systems of the global north manage to simultaneously trace their lineage to ancient Greece and disavow habits of thought that are 200 or 300 years old. Thus, the development and use of scientific racism for colonialist profit-making is at best considered an absent-minded mistake of the past in the lifespan of an otherwise enlightening Western civilization, when the subjects of imperial and colonial regimes know very well how meticulously the laws governing territory, kinship, labor, and nature have to be crafted and policed. When the Guyanese poet Grace Nichols says that poverty is the price we pay for the sun, she's talking of both plantation slavery and contemporary neo-colonial forms of exploitation. Thus, it becomes important to challenge the widespread notion that 18th and 19th century biologistic and somatic understandings of racial difference and hierarchy were overcome in the moment of formal emancipation, leaving in place a few essentially harmless traditions, such as Zwart Piet, that may occasionally seem racist, but are on the whole merely cultural. The panelists will show both the impossibility and the inadvisability of claiming such a break. In short, our goal today is to extend our understanding of the marriage of race and gender in human rights work, as well as engage with both conceptual and practical questions of accountability and confronting dominant ideology in the UN human rights system. With that, let me turn to the panelists now. First, to Pooja Badarinath, who will address the question of how colonialist ideas of racial difference affect contemporary understandings of gender.
Thank you, Dipika. What I'm going to do today is talk about the story of the Sexual Rights Initiative, which is the coalition of 6 organizations who've worked at the UN Human Rights Council since 2005. And this is the history, this is the story of how the SRI came to the conclusion and sort of recommendations and our own grappling of how the UN system, particularly the Human Rights Council, deals with the concept of race and gender. And this is going to be like an illustrative case study based on what we observed in during the resolution on elimination of discrimination against women and girls in sport. This resolution, introduced by South Africa in 2019, March, was subsequently adopted. But the resolution tried to deal with, and rightly talk about, the various kinds of discrimination that does go on in competitive elite sport. Now, the impetus for the resolution, and while the resolution addresses discrimination in sport broadly, it also specifically talks about the particular regulation passed by the International Athletics Federation, now the World Athletics, around requiring women to undergo coercive, unwanted, and often harmful practices into medical intervention to participate as women. The reason being that they had an elevated testosterone, an arbitrary level that was set. And this was challenged by the South African gold medalist, Caster Semenya, which also was the impetus. Now, the case of Caster is not an isolated one. It has had a history, and previous to her, there was the Indian athlete Duty Chand, who had done a similar challenge on a similar regulation. At that time, the Court of Arbitration sided with her and said that there is no correlation between the elevated testosterone and performance, and any such regulation is neither proportionate nor necessary. Yet, the sporting authorities brought the regulation back to tell women with elevated testosterone that they needed to undergo harmful medical interventions. Not necessary at all. The resolution then asked the OHCHR to mandate a report from the OHCHR. For us, while we were at SRI, the resolution for us dealt with three things. While there are many, many different ways of looking at it, but for us, it dealt with three things: gender, race, and both. And what we observed was, while the resolution actually is trying to grapple with the complex nature of race and gender and the violations that happens upon the body of women and girls, women of color in sport, and it sought to name that discrimination, and how that got picked up and discussed is kind of also part of the story. Now, what we see this is as a problem of an arbitrary measure of what is right level of testosterone, and women with elevated, again, flawed science, going back to one of Dipika's question on flawed science, was used to say some women are what was then wrongly perceived as almost like a male hormone, have higher testosterone, despite sporting bodies saying there is no correlation. But what then we also saw happen was that the sporting authorities themselves have repeatedly said that through many talks, and this is documented, that it has been that the monitoring and investigating of higher levels of testosterone has been exclusively for women from the global south, and all indications are that they're Black and brown women. The seemingly neutral regulation which tried to protect women's sport was actually being used to monitor certain bodies from the global south who were women of color. Now, for us, it was very important to say, as the resolution and subsequent report also said, that any such regulation is, of course, a violation. It should be stopped, as the resolution also said, and the subsequent report, that is a violation of right to health, it is a violation of right to bodily autonomy, it amounts to torture, and that nobody should be put
Et
through.
personne ne devrait subir ce test.
Tipo de pruebas, pero esto no era suficiente para realmente presentar.
Actually, look at the roots of where such monitoring and policing within sport actually occurred. And in this case, it is important to highlight that the first Black woman to ever win Wimbledon was Althea Gibson, who was an African-American woman who was forced to go through chromosome test to participate in the US championship. This was long ago. And to say that there aren't semblance of what happened to Althea Gibson then to what's happening to the women of color now within these same sporting authorities is almost sounds like a willful ignorance of not looking at the past to see what's happening in the present. For us, what this meant was there was an arbitrariness of using testosterone, of course, but it, instead of focusing around the rights of the women, the rights of the athletes at the center, what the IAF and the sporting regulations did was try to protect, as I said, the women's sport. But in effect, what they were seeming to protect is a construction of who the women are who should participate in this sport. There's a cultural construction of that which is being protected, which is often seen as white, feminine presenting, seemingly heterosexual. And I'm sure we can go on and on and on about that. And almost every one of us have encountered this construction of womanhood at different points of time. And while this was happening, what we observed at during the informal negotiations at the Human Rights Council and the subsequent report is either a lip service to race, or even to one mention, or even an outright hostility to talk about race in the informal negotiation, which actually ensured that the title did not have the term race. And it was, to some extent, for us present there, it was almost like it was incomprehensible for people to understand how these two actually are linked. And this incomprehension, then what it for us does is privileges certain aspects of identities and personalities over everything else. Now, and then it almost assumes that all of our lives are a sum total of multiple identities, but it is so much more than that. And it is this combination of how the multiple oppressions, which individually can commit violations, but together were forming such intense violations upon women's bodies, was almost incomprehensible to the system then and the people working on that. Now, it was this relationship that eventually for us meant that the regulations passed by IAF was so problematic. But this story is not just about elite sport. Like I was mentioning, it actually goes beyond sport, and we see it in other contemporary institutions. And at that particular instant, the sporting regulations of codifying these notions of womanhood, which was so entrenched in colonial practices of what a womanhood actually came to the forefront. We at SRI believe that this incomprehension is almost willful or non-willful, and we are not able to understand what we're speaking about, is also arises from this perception that sport, like other institutions, are neutral, which we don't believe anything can be, and apolitical. Whereas all of us kind of know sporting, large competitive sport is neither apolitical nor neutral. They are hugely profit-making bodies. They foster nationalism, often toxically. They further race and gender stereotypes. And there is a lot of political investment in sport countries hosting sporting events. And at the same time, we also know corporations, like large corporations, actually own sporting events, competitions, making tremendous amount of money by being exploitative and extractive in the way they work, also mirroring how colonization and how colonial corporations or nation states were exploitative and extractive. We also believe that the same claims can be made across board in different institutions and in our own countries, where certain communities who are above, most powerful, then end up continuing to perpetuate the same practices, either based on race, caste, class, ethnicity, citizenship, migration status. And so for us, it meant that until and unless a meaningful engagement on the history of oppression, on where this oppression originally began, and a reparation to these oppression is committed to, we will continue to meet these kind of incomprehension and almost an ignorance, because it also meant that it is a way of avoiding our own complicity in perpetuating these oppressions. So for us, it is particularly necessary, because we work at international human rights system in many ways, to say that non-discrimination, then it's necessary to highlight non-discrimination doesn't automatically mean equality and justice. To quote from the very many feminist movements we're in, it requires grappling with power, and it requires often giving up power. And SRI has, and for us, a lot of the framing around this came from framing it as the right to bodily autonomy, which means self-determination, not only of our own bodies, but of our lives. And this isn't an individualistic expression of choice, but it also means being able to access the very same rights that we talk about. But at the same time, it is also about unpacking the ways in which structural and systemic oppressions like patriarchy, like racism and white supremacy are translated into laws, into policies and systems which impact individuals, but at the same time, we're especially individuals who do not conform to stereotypes set by these very same oppressions. And we need to start talking about that. At the same time, it obligates states, and it is a primary obligation of states, not only to respect, protect, and fulfill the rights of these individuals, but also look at the structures and systems that enforce these oppressive laws and policies. So as much as it is about the individual, it is also about how the system lets people continue perpetuating these violations. And thank you.
So this is the SRI panel on race matters. We've just had some introductions and heard from the first panelist, Pooja Badarinath, who works at the SRI. And Pooja has spoken about the ways in which race and gender, old ideas, scientifically suspect ideas of race and gender, etc., where you showed themselves, made themselves visible in the resolution on the sports resolution on eliminating discrimination against women and girls in sports. And I'm sure we're going to pick up some of the points that Pooja has touched upon. This idea of sort of, protecting, that famous title of, I think, Alice Miller's paper from way back, protecting women versus protecting women's rights, that idea of being used, how even the language of race was sacrificed, the scientific expertise that was brought to bear on these political decisions, etc. So we'll pick some of these questions up, I think, as we go. In the meantime, can I please welcome people who have just joined because of the technical difficulties. Very sorry that you weren't able to catch us right at the beginning, but welcome now. With that, can I please move to Dr. T, Dr. Tlaleng Mofokeng, who will speak to the importance of placing race and gender at the center of a human rights-based approach to health, and include some observations about what COVID-19 is teaching us about this. Before I hand over to you, though, Dr. T, just for people who might have just joined, Tlaleng Mofokeng is a medical practitioner from Johannesburg and has recently been appointed the Special Rapporteur on Right to Health. So over to you now, Dr. T.
Thank you so much for this opportunity and for this gathering. Mine is just to give you, a perspective from our own lived experience and, of course, professional experience in the space. And perhaps when time permits, we can go further into sort of what I envision, for my role within the United Nations system as a special rapporteur. But there is something to be said, I think, about, the negative history of medicine and a continuation of the denial, of that horrible history. in terms of slavery and, the experimentation on Black people that happened around, syphilis. Some of us may know Dr. Sims, who used to practice gynecological procedures on Black women without anesthesia, because as he called it, that Black women don't feel pain, and how those types of ideas still find expression in how we practice medicine globally to impact negatively, Black women and women of color. We also know of Henrietta Lacks, whose cells were extracted from her body without consent and have been the cornerstone of all biomedical technologies and advancements, from vaccination to cancer treatment and all sorts of things, and raising real questions around ethics of care. We know for sure that gender and racial bias of medicines does exist. It even, exists and finds expression in which conditions in medicine gets researched and which don't. And again, which pharmaceutical industry, places bets on and resourcing in terms of solutions and coming up, with biomedical solutions. It's also important to talk about the racism, that and sexism that we see in the othering and demonizing of indigenous health systems across the world, especially in the global south, in communities that are more poorer. And yet we know in some regions up to 80% of populations seek help outside of the traditional Western health facility. And how this history of medicine is important to understand perhaps the relationship that Black communities and Black populations, have with the lack of trust, in the medical system. And there is something to be said as well around erasure of scholarship, especially of Black women and women of color, where our lived experience is called upon a lot when people are doing research and studies. And yet that lived experience and that knowledge isn't seen as sophisticated enough, but it's that same knowledge that people then, write their masters and PhDs on, and they become the global experts in terms of our own lives and our own lived experiences, yet our own thought leadership and scholarship is erased. And of course, we know that science is not perfect. Medicine is not a perfect science. And so we need to be deliberate in how we don't erase, the lived experiences, or at least reduce them to non-sophisticated knowledge. For example, a lot of us have been hearing a lot in the global spaces in the last couple of years how people talk about reproductive justice. They talk about intersectionality, and very few will actually credit those frameworks to the Black women and the women of color who brought all those to the fore, and informed by real lived experiences. And Professor Kimberly Crenshaw makes a legal argument, around intersectionality. And so it is about, being careful and being aware of gentrification of such struggles and such frameworks as intersectionality and reproductive justice, without an understanding of the origins and the honesty and resourcing of efforts that then aim to end systems of oppression, because both those frameworks call us, all of us, to be committed to ending systems of oppression and not just putting band-aid. And what you will find is that the global North grant makers, a lot of philanthropies, will turn these struggles and the call to end systems of oppression as too political, and they just want proximity, and many are just happy and content to be proximal to governments, but really their proximity and their efforts are devoid of accountability. And so as I foresee my vision for the role as special rapporteur, it's to really be honest about how, and call things what they are. There's a difference between saying that race is a risk factor, for example, versus acknowledging that it's actually racism that Black people experience that creates a life of stress, that then creates impact on their internal organs and physical health to a point where they have a higher prevalence of chronic illnesses like high blood pressure, diabetes, asthma, and ultimately lead to a shorter lifespan. And I think those are some of the important conversations that need to be had. But we need to name things for what they are, so that we can truly acknowledge their impact. And if it's negative, then really work at achieving justice and being resourced and fully resourced without conditions to the types of funding that many of these populations and Black people and women of color who work on these very important topics often find themselves, scrambling around for the little crumbs that are left over at the end of the day. So it is important, to talk about how all the other systems of oppression have a direct negative impact on health outcomes, and also be honest and really, without fear, talk about the structural drivers of illness, but also of the reasons why it serves certain people to have these systems of oppression still in place, and then really ask the questions about whose agenda is being set. And it's important for me, I think, to really take on this new role with the understanding and bring forward my own understanding and believe that people aren't inherently vulnerable. There are situations and experiences that make people vulnerable, but that vulnerability is part of the human experience. And whether you are being made vulnerable by age, race, gender, class, sexuality, geography, or you are an undocumented migrant or a young person born with HIV, that all these people and all these different types of vulnerabilities require that we still protect, respect, and promote people's human rights. And I'll stop here so that I can give other panelists time. But that's just my ideas and my thoughts on how I see race and gender intersecting in especially global South communities and populations of Black people. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. T. Okay, so this seems to now be becoming a pattern. Before we move on, a little more technical stuff. If people are struggling with audio, you can also watch this live on YouTube, and Juan has just put the link. You'll find the link in the chat box. So for folks who are struggling with audio or for other reasons, please go to YouTube. And thanks for your patience with all the technical hiccups. Again, so just to sort of recap for folks who might have come later, we've had 2 of the 4 panelists speak. We've had Pooja speak about race and gender with a particular example, in the particular example of the sports resolution recently. And we've had Dr. Tlaleng Mofokeng speak about structural racism as a sort of a comorbidity factor, if you like, and raising some questions around resources, around political will, etc. as well. Again, answering the question of why we need to think about race and gender and them together when we're thinking about a human rights-based approach to health. So this part of the conversation was really about, why race and health, why now, what do these 2 things mean together? And now we'd like to shift the focus a little bit, but not really, by looking at questions of accountability from a couple of perspectives. First, we'll have Ms. Vereen Shepherd, who will reflect on what a robust understanding of reparations on the grounds of racial oppression would look like, and why reparations are necessary for advancing the project of decolonization.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Greetings, everyone, and thanks to the organizers for inviting me to participate in this forum, convened to examine the widespread nature of and the workings of dominant ideologies of race and gender in the UN human rights system. So as you have heard, I have been tasked specifically with providing a perspective on what would be a robust understanding of reparations on the grounds of racial oppression and why reparations are necessary for advancing substantive human rights. My main argument is that the demand for reparatory justice is an appeal for accountability on the part of state parties who are implicated in colonial wrongs, that such colonial wrongs rested on ideologies of racism, white supremacy, and disregard for human rights, which remain, troublingly, part of the legacy of colonialism. and that the failure to respond to the demands for reparative justice demonstrates a lack of commitment to the ideas of human rights to which UN member states are bound. There are spaces within the UN that have accommodated conversations on reparation, including the Working Group of Experts on People of African Descent and members of special procedures or treaty bodies. The GA has also been a space, the HRC and the CERT. So it is up to NGOs, CSOs, and members of special procedures or treaty bodies to keep on recommending measures that can be taken within the UN system to challenge and dismantle systemic racism, which is evident in the failure of many states to respond positively to reparatory justice demands. By way of a contemporary context, let me say that in recent months, amidst a global pandemic, citizens in the United States of America, joined by citizens across the world, have marched and are still marching to demand justice for George Floyd and an end to racism. There is now an urgency to demand justice, and in public discourse, as the global community acknowledges and confronts all forms of contemporary racism, racial discrimination, xenophobia, and racial intolerance. The activism of anti-racist movements such as Black Lives Matter has brought status quo challenging models such as defund the police into the mainstream. Alternate approaches and concepts that were once considered too academic, too unrealistic, and unachievable now occupy center stage in policy debates. Reparatory justice for indigenous peoples and people of African descent, once deemed highly improbable, now lie firmly in public consciousness as universities, churches, pub chains, and financial institutions in the UK and the USA, for example, own up to their colonial wrongs and commit to a variety of reparative actions. Statues of colonial era icons are being toppled from Belgium to Barbados, and calls have intensified for the renaming of streets and buildings, even like our own Palais Wilson, in order to construct a more liberating narrative for affected populations and dethrone the old absolutisms and icons. In this watershed moment then, we must take action and continue to actively pursue decolonization through international bodies such as the United Nations and multilateral bodies like the European Union, African Union, and the Caribbean Community, or CARICOM. One matter that is being pursued through international and multilateral bodies is the issue of reparation. The pursuit of reparation is not a modern phenomenon. It has a long genealogy and a generally accepted meaning and rationale. Reparation comes from the Latin word for repair and is defined as repair for a wrong or wrongs committed. Removing the long-term effects of that wrong or crime upon the victims and their descendants is its ultimate goal. Reparations can be interstate, state to individual, and state to a collective or a society. Reparation has long been conceived of as having the potential to right wrongs and achieve peace and reconciliation among contending parties. As the Special Rapporteur on Racism reminded us in her 2019 report to the General Assembly, and I quote, "The dominant principles of reparation are or should be based on equity, sovereign equality, interdependence, common interest, and cooperation among all states, following the 1974 GA recognition of a new international economic order, essential to correcting inequalities and redressing injustices rooted in colonialism," end of quote. Further, the remaining vestiges of alien and colonial domination, foreign occupation, racial discrimination, apartheid, and neocolonialism in all its forms continue to be among the greatest obstacles to the full emancipation and progress of the developing countries and all the peoples involved. The Declaration on the Establishment of a New International Economic Order provided a blueprint for the structural reform of the international system and international law that remains vital to repairing the structures of inequality and discrimination that were built predominantly from the legacies of colonialism and African enslavement. Later, there was the 2001 draft articles on responsibility of states for internationally wrongful acts. In the UN system, there is support for the idea that states should treat the pursuit of a just and equitable international order as an urgent dimension of reparations for slavery and colonialism. However, there appears to be more focus on modern-day slavery and colonialism than on the historic crimes against people of African descent through the Ma'afa. Yet the yoke of those historical violations continues to impede the enjoyment of human rights. The history of the Caribbean can be used to show why reparation is a just cause and why it is linked to racism and human rights violations. And first of all, I agree with those who argue that racial discrimination was at the core of European colonialism. It undergirded the way in which people were captured and forcefully relocated from Africa to the Americas, the ways in which they were subjected to chattel enslavement, the punishments they received for anti-slavery resistance, including mass lynching, and the cultural imperialism that they faced with the right to indigenous names, languages, and traditions not respected. The intersection of racism and gender was clear under slavery, as scholars have shown that the double burden of production and reproduction fell disproportionately on women, who after the ending of the trafficking in Black souls were expected to reproduce the labor force and keep the plantations going. Racial discrimination was also at the core of the emancipation plan to reparation, because it was predicated on the belief that Africans were not people but property on whose heads a levy could be placed for reimbursement. Planters received £20 million in compensation for their claim of loss of so-called property. And if we monetize the apprenticeship system, the 4 extra years of free labor from 1834 to 1838 imposed on the Caribbean, another 25 to 27 million pounds can be added. As Eric Foner puts it, the newly freed got nothing but freedom. And of course, I believe freedom was important, is important, but I think we understand what he's saying. Indeed, every attempt was made to recreate the slave relations of production and use racist laws and policies to defeat the hopes and expectations of emancipation. And when people protested neo-slavery, many lives were lost. The early negotiators of independence in the Caribbean also faced racism, as their demands for financial settlement was scoffed at, while the Colombo Plan gave other ethnic groups a development plan. So at the core of refusal to accept responsibility by European states is racial discrimination, based on their scant regard for the torture and terrorism perpetrated, the attempt to deny resources to the emancipated and to the newly independent states, unlike the attitude to other groups. Now, under the UN Basic Principles and Guidelines of the Right to a Remedy and Reparation for Victims of Gross Violations of International Human Rights Law and Serious Violations of International Humanitarian Law, adopted by the General Assembly in 2005, there are 5 forms of remedy and reparations for violations. First is restitution, and that is what Haiti is claiming because of what France extracted in exchange for the right to their independence, the right of Haitians to independence. Compensation is the second, then rehabilitation, satisfaction, and guarantees of non-repetition. Restitution aims to restore to the victim, or to restore the victim to the original situation before the gross violations of international human rights law or serious violations of international humanitarian law occurred. Compensation is the economically determined damage incurred, and rehabilitation refers to the medical and psychological care, as well as legal and social services. The CARICOM 10-point plan for reparatory justice is a current negotiating strategy chosen by Caribbean regional heads to hold states responsible for the wrongs of the past. And it captures the essential 5 forms of remedy that I just outlined. But it also entails a full formal apology from the governments of Europe, a repatriation program for African descended people who wish to return to their homeland, and a development program to eradicate poverty and underdevelopment. It is no secret that several governments have denied victims and their descendants their due apologies, offering statements of regret. But in March 2019, 535 members of the European Parliament voted to adopt a resolution to address and rectify past injustices and crimes against humanity perpetuated in the name of European colonialism. In a press release, the EU Parliament suggested, and I quote, carrying out reparations such as apologizing publicly and returning stolen artifacts to their countries of origin, as well as to present a comprehensive perspective on colonialism and slavery in the educational curriculum. So reparatory justice is an active and continuous process concerning both our past and our present. Within the United Nations, there is unilateral acknowledgement that reparations alone cannot eradicate, undo, or uproot the consequences of 400 years of colonialism. But as the UN High Commissioner, Michelle Bachelet, has emphasized, it is necessary to make amends for centuries of violence and discrimination, including through formal apologies, truth-telling processes, and reparations in various forms. I think, as Dominique will tell you later, the working group of experts on people of African descent has always raised this issue in its deliberations and public discussions. And I think that is why we do mention reparation in the program of activities for the International Decade, and that was also in the International Year in 2011. The Committee for the Elimination of Racial Discrimination, CERD, is one possible avenue through which reparations can be pursued by individuals using Article 4 of the Convention, as well as Articles 11, 12, and 13 under the ICERD. And people can go and look up what those articles say. But it is of utmost importance for one to understand that the full implementation of the ICERD is a necessary means of achieving reparations for slavery and colonialism. The convention is one of the foundations on which the equality of all human rights, the equality of all human beings, regardless of race, is asserted, with the convention explicitly stating any doctrine of superiority based on racial differentiation is scientifically false, morally condemnable, socially unjust, and dangerous, and that there is no justification for racial discrimination in theory or in practice anywhere. So to conclude, I do admit that it is easy to get compensation for current rather than historic wrongs, and that there are many challenges to successful reparations for indigenous genocide, the forced transatlantic relocation of African people, and chattel enslavement, and to claim a just settlement by the descendants of the original victims. The primary challenge to pursuing reparations is this intertemporal principle, which claims that slavery was not considered a violation of international law at the time, during the centuries it happened. But there are legal answers to this claim, which we can all research. Despite these barriers, there have been successful cases of reparatory justice, which should encourage those in the movement to press on. As Professor Tendai Achume, the Special Rapporteur on Contemporary Forms of Racism, Racial Discrimination, Xenophobia, and Related Intolerance, said in her report presented at the 74th session to the General Assembly on August 21, 2019, the historic racial injustices of slavery and colonialism remain largely unaccounted for today. So I agree with her, and I would emphasize that they require restitution, compensation, satisfaction, rehabilitation, and guarantees of non-repetition. Slavery and colonialism denied persons equal protection before the law on the basis of their race. And one of the persisting legacies of slavery and colonialism remains the unequal application of the law to descendants of historically enslaved and colonized peoples. And yes, in the end, reparations alone cannot achieve the eradication of racial discrimination. Nevertheless, reparations are a vital aspect of a global order genuinely committed to the inherent dignity of all, irrespective of race, ethnicity, or national origin. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Maureen Shepherd. We'll move now to the fourth panelist, Dominique Day. Before that, as you're accustomed by now, I've been asked to suggest that maybe panelists speak a little bit slower. to enable the interpreters to be able to catch what they're saying. So lots of interesting and potentially controversial points also raised on the question of reparation, which I'm sure we'll have an opportunity to come back to, but also some continuities with what others have spoken about you know, what is the relationship between past and the present when we're talking about racism, how far back do we go, etc. And we'll come to those questions. To move to Dominique Day, who's the last panelist, Dominique will speak to the question of how dominant racist ideologies impede the work of seemingly neutral human rights systems and offer some insights into what it means to confront power. Over to you, Dominique.
Okay, you can hear me now, right? Okay. Thank you, Dipika. And I wanna just take a second to thank SRI for this really special convening. I hope everyone's experiencing all of these powerhouse women, including the really thoughtful and complex introductory remarks, as powerfully as I am. It's a real privilege to be on a panel with all of you. I'm really blown away. I also want to welcome Dr. Tlaleng. I'm hoping we get a chance to work together now that you joined the special procedures. And you know, I've had a good opportunity to work with Doreen in my time on the working group, and it's wonderful to see you always. You know, listening, and I'm going to try to actually bring in some of what we've been talking about already today, because you know, listening to the ways that we're talking about intersectionality, the ways we're talking about the ways that race and gender are instrumentalized to oppress rather than to liberate in our framings, in our power systems, I think there's some interesting ideas that come out of that. And one of them, just to pick up directly on something Doreen was saying, is this concept of fragmentation and how directly opposed it is to our framings around intersectionality, right? So every panelist thus far has talked about intersectionality as the ways in which we understand our identities to be coalitional, the ways in which race and gender shouldn't be severed. There's violence to us as an individual, there's violence to us as communities when we look to really separate out the ways in which we understand our identities into this convenient taxonomy, this convenient classification where I have to choose between my race, my gender, my sexual orientation, my gender identity. And while that taxonomy may be convenient for some, right, it's a fragmentation of identity that powerfully diminishes our collective capacity for liberation. And that's something we're aware of in some spaces, right? If you look at research on Palestinian activism, for example, there's a lot of talk about the ways that fragmentation of identity has been openly used to diminish the effectiveness of activism in those spaces. And I think, as Doreen was just saying, we've seen not just occasional or unintentional fragmentation of identity, but the explicit and ongoing fragmentation of African identities, community identity, family, in the trade and trafficking in enslaved Africans, and in the maintaining of a system of colonial and oppression during enslavement. And so this idea of fragmenting family, fragmenting identity, and then, just to be super clear, offering pockets of power to those who are complicit or at least amenable to that has long been a way that power systems maintain their power. And so when Pooja was talking earlier about the ways in which race was sort of pulled out of these, when Dr. Tlaleng was talking earlier about the ways in which we're looking at these systems and certain people are exploited, certain people are allowed to be used in this way, that fragmentation, right? That fragmentation of a community into parts, some of which are disposable, some of which are available for exploitation and abuse, that fragmentation necessarily cuts against our liberatory potential. So, you know, the benefit of intersectionality is that it is a direct counter to this idea of fragmentation. If you understand fragmentation as a taxonomy that is designed to limit our power, to limit our strength, you could then look at what Kimberly Crenshaw says in her article, right? So what she says in Intersectionality in 1991, I think, she says, we need to conceptualize race as coalitional. We need to stop fragmenting these identities and instead understand that our racial identities are coalitional identities that must incorporate and are strengthened by our gender and other categories of identity. So with that beginning, let me talk a little bit about the UN systems, right? And I guess I have a few things to say when we're talking about racist ideologies and their implementations in practice, but also about these systems that are massively powerful in ways that individuals and communities struggle to even meaningfully counter in words, forget about in impact. And I think one thing to remember for all of us is that these systems operate the way they're designed to, even if that's not how they're described. So there's a reason that we talk about neo-colonial, neoliberal constructs today, and that the same people we saw in power 200 years ago look the same today. You could put these people in different clothing, you could offer them different technological devices, and yet the dynamics would look quite the same. And there's a reason for that. That's actually the design of the system. And even if the system says something different, it's proven wrong every day. So, we make country visits. That's part of what we do in the working group. And we did a country visit. I wasn't actually on the working group at the time, but we did a country visit to the United States in 2016 and uplifted many of the issues that you're hearing about today. And let me be 100% clear that these issues are longstanding issues in the United States. I'm also an American. They're well known, they're well documented, the data is clear. There's been a massive amount of cultural production and knowledge production documenting intersectional issues of racism and misogyny that impact particularly people of African descent in the US. So the working group went, it was able to talk to many, many people, was able to uplift many of these issues and present them to the government in 2016. What we've seen is, the report was accepted. We haven't necessarily seen the recommendations set forth in our report adopted in any meaningful way. And maybe to push for a moment, people would like to say, well, oh, that's because of this political administration. And that's true. This administration in the United States, the Trump administration, has not engaged with any special procedure since 2017. There have been no visits. There's no responses. We write to them all the time about violations that are happening. We hear nothing back. At the same time, this is not unique to a political administration. And in fact, it more bears the hallmarks of a system of power that is unconcerned with anything that doesn't destabilize it. So we presented our recommendations to a prior administration, but to be honest, there's no recommendation that the working group made that community groups, academics, scientific experts had not already made in those contexts. And in fact, even the reforms that were suggested by the prior administration came toward, in criminal justice, for example, came at the end, right? We're talking about how do you change policing? There were several recommendations at the end, and few of them would have prevented the tragic incident we saw with the murder of George Floyd that we all observed on video this summer. So the question isn't necessarily about an election, although elections are crucially important. And as an American, I can tell you I'm sitting with that right now. The question is actually about how power understands its obligation to those who don't hold privilege, how power understands its obligation to people who look like me, like everyone on this panel, right? And so these systems are operating as they're designed to. We saw in our country visit the opportunity to offer a lot of feedback that hasn't necessarily been incorporated into the fabric of American life, and that's not so unusual, right? But what's interesting is we also had earlier this summer an urgent debate in the Human Rights Council after the death of George Floyd, as global protests were taken up around the world. The African countries approached the Human Rights Council and asked for an urgent debate on systemic racism committed largely by law enforcement, but also elsewhere in the United States and elsewhere. And this debate took place in the council over the course of a few days. It was historic, it was important, and states got up. and made very strong public statements committing to anti-racism, affirming in some cases with these words that Black Lives Matter, acknowledging recommendations the working group had made in the past and committing to look at those for how they might actually start implementing their commitments to anti-racism as their citizens were protesting in their capitals. And so these conversations were happening in the public, it was happening in the forum, in the council, and we had this really beautiful opportunity to see what looked like a moment of racial understanding in the Human Rights Council, and perhaps it was, right? Time is gonna tell. History is our teacher, I think Maureen might say. But what we also saw in that exact same moment was the shepherding of a resolution through the Human Rights Council. And there was supposed to be a resolution on the debate. Initially, there had been calls for a commission on inquiry. There had been calls for operational provisions that would allow a real investigation and interrogation of systemic racism, and a real development of recommendations to really dismantle the systemic racism that wasn't just impacting Black Americans, but was impacting all of us, all of our countries, and was being related to by activists and citizens worldwide. This resolution was shepherded by the Africa Group, and initially had quite robust language, and we had spoken in favor of that. There were a few days where an intense series of negotiations took place, reportedly. We were not involved in these negotiations. And eventually the resolution that was adopted was significantly watered down. So there's some really beautiful language in a resolution as the outcome of this urgent debate, talking about systemic racism, talking about commitments to dismantle systemic racism, but any acknowledgement of the need to act, any acknowledgement in, let's just talk about UN points of power, any acknowledgement of the need to allocate resources, any acknowledgement of the need to develop expertise around what's actually motivating racism was scrubbed from the resolution. And it's interesting, right? When I say the systems operate the way they're intended to, you'll see in the international media all over the place. You'll see Western European leaders refuse to meet with Trump. Western European leaders snub Ivanka Trump. Western European leaders roll their eyes at Trump, right? We see this kind of performative disdain for the American administration. But when it came down to getting this resolution passed, and the United States, which no longer even sits on the Human Rights Council, which withdrew from the Human Rights Council, when the United States did not want to be censured, did not want to be investigated or accountable for its systemic racism that has gone on with impunity and possibly deliberately so, right? To go way back in history, one of the US's initial concerns about the US about the UN was that it would give a remedy to Negroes, which is how we were called at the time, that it would give a remedy to people of African descent seeking redress in this brand new UN system. And the initial efforts of W.B. Du Bois and the NAACP to do that were immediately quashed by one of our feminist heroes, Eleanor Roosevelt, right? So we had this idea that, well, you know, all of these leaders who struggle to even work with an American administration that is so committed to racism that they don't even bother to hide it anymore. And yet we saw an amazing closing of ranks among countries with massive amounts of resources and power and privilege to make sure the ultimate resolution did not reflect any sort of accountability whatsoever. And in fact, we're still arguing to try to see how that resolution can be operationalized to actually have some impact and to really meet this moment properly. The countries, and what we heard at the time, right, was that there is an immense amount of pressure on the Africa Group. Our working group, and maybe another thing I wanted to say is the ways these systems also protect themselves. Our working group certainly issued, and jointly with the Special Rapporteur on Racism, a statement at the front end. But as this was happening, we also issued a statement saying, we are hearing that powerful countries are really subverting this process, that the idea of a consensus resolution is being used to strip the resolution of any meaningful content that is operational. And we would encourage the council to take an up or down vote. We would encourage the council to ask countries to be openly accountable for their opinions with respect to the urgency of dismantling systemic racism. We issued a statement, I believe in conjunction with the Special Rapporteur on Racism, shortly before the vote. And what's interesting is, and we sent it to several embassies as well. What's interesting was that the UN itself declined to issue a press release on our statement. The UN itself, the Office of the Special Procedures Leadership, declined to issue a press release saying that we might, as though this were possible, that we might unduly influence the council, that it might be seen as trying to interfere with the workings of the Human Rights Council. So I guess my point is sort of a lot of inside baseball, right? But I guess my point here that I want to like really offer is sometimes these moments of massive social distress and real calls for change that are met by systems of power with you know, analyses that try to restore them to a status quo that's comfortable. Sometimes it also gives us an opportunity to see what's real. I think it would have been very difficult for many people to believe that the Western countries could close ranks to strip a resolution of content. I think it would have been hard for many people to believe that, that the very group charged with sharing its expertise on systemic racism and anti-Black racism would be denied the opportunity to make a public statement in advance of a vote by the Human Rights Council, a series of sovereign nations that are absolutely capable of maintaining their own interests and not being influenced unduly. But the system itself, right, what we've seen over and over, and particularly in the areas of race, these systems do protect themselves. These systems operate as they're designed to, they protect themselves. And we see how individuals, right, that decision was made by an individual, not to issue our press release. Individuals play roles in that. So when we're talking about anti-racism, dismantling systemic racism, we're also talking about the ways individuals may be held accountable, the ways individuals' actions should be uplifted for their impact in either perpetuating or dismantling racist structures. Here's another example that doesn't have to do with the arcane workings of the Human Rights Council. We did a country visit to Belgium a few years ago. We found that children of African descent were being systematically diverted from mainstream education to vocational education, including children whose parents had graduate degrees, who had tremendous parental involvement in education. And the parents, when they would push on this, would be threatened with child welfare proceedings, would be delegitimized, all sorts of things. Parents had no ability to push back against this on individual spaces. And we heard about this in every town and city we went to when we visited Belgium, which of course is a very small country, but a very, you know, the government system there doesn't contemplate this level of unanimity in action. Every single one of these kids who's being pushed into vocational education, even though it's a systemic practice, it's affecting a massive percentage of children of African descent, every single child pushed out of university-bound education was done so at the decision of one teacher, right? So you have a systemic racist practice that's being perpetuated by many individual decisions of people in power. The subjective decision-making of people in power at a very small level is creating a generational experience for children of African descent. And so I guess my third point is that it's actually really clear that it is actually individuals who, even though we talk about systems and institutional racism, individuals keep these things going. And maybe I can harken back to another thing Pooja was saying about the willful ignorance of the ways in which these systems were focusing on Black bodies, I think she said the incomprehension that this was a highly racialized impact. You know, we have a discourse for this also in race talk, and we talk about strategic colorblindness, right? In the Declaration of Human Rights, It talks about offering people equality without distinction according to race. And for some of us, that means people should not be burdened on the basis of race. For others, that means I should never have to think about race. I should never have to look at race. And this idea that their racial colorblindness is wielded strategically as a tool has been unbelievably powerful in perpetuating certain power, right? So we understand that if you're, and we hear this all the time, I think 3 of the 4 panelists are Black women. I'm sure everyone's heard it personally as much as I have. If someone says to you, well, I don't even see color, I don't even see race, which is a super common thing people like to say, or they talk about purple people. I don't care if people are Black, white, or purple, as though there are purple people, right? People who claim not to see race are also giving themselves license not to see racism. People who claim not to see race are giving themselves a framework to avoid accountability or even analysis with respect to the racism that's perpetuated inside their own systems. So this willful ignorance that Pooja talks about with respect to how these sport body policing, I'm sorry, that's a very bad summary, but how this was actually operationalized largely, if not exclusively, against brown and Black bodies, the incomprehension that didn't even allow you to bring race into that conversation. This is not a lack of understanding. This is not about educating people about racism. This is actually a strategic colorblindness used to preempt a conversation that could lead to authority, power, inclusion, access, opportunity. And that, I think, is an important thing for us to remember as well. When we're talking about systems working the way they're designed to, understand that these tools of fragmentation, these tools of strategic colorblindness are tools that allow people to perpetuate the status quo. And if you have any question about that, you can look at the events of this summer. You can look at the ways in which symbolic change that was impossible a year ago is now absolutely on the table. How many companies, governments, and organizations, including organizations committed to anti-racism, are actually struggling to find, to recover a status quo that allowed them to basically operate within a racist framework. This idea of the real versus the realistic that other panelists have talked about really does animate our, even our sort of charitable humanitarian context. And so for us, I think we have this question, we're talking about human rights contexts, how much of the fact that these grew inside of a world, inside of a colonial and a post-colonial world, right, that absolutely had systemic racism as its foundation, how much of that was explicitly adopted, how much of it was implicitly adopted, and I guess how much of that involves people desperately seeking to relegate race to merely a lens to think about human rights instead of understanding race as an accelerator, right? As a facilitator for particular forms of abuse and particular forms of oppression. And I think when we talk about intersectionality, it's actually
Teacher, esto es.
Oh, sorry. It's actually a specific way. Intersectionality is a specific way for us to recover what's real, to recover the truth of who we are as we fight systems of power that look constantly to push us aside, right? When a system creates small pockets of power, it's for us to actually resist being fragmented and instead to really celebrate what we bring and who we can be.
Thank you for that, Dominique. So much there. The articulation of fragmentation as taxonomy, I think, really helps us to sort of think about, and especially when you also put that against sort of, you know, fragmentation versus intersectionality, it really, I think, helps us understand the ways in which these some of these problems are coming into being. There's a lot of material that all of you have put out there already. Before we move to a couple of the questions that we've received, I'd like to give each of you an opportunity to pick up on or respond to or elaborate on something that that someone else might have said after you had a chance to speak. So just a couple of minutes for you to either ask questions of each other or pick up on things and respond to things that other people said. Go for it, Dr. T, go for it, all yours.
Thank you. Yeah, and I really appreciate all the different angles, and how the speakers are all just deepening even my own personal understanding, of how these issues impact communities at large. And I do think that we really have to be intentional about how we use intersectionality as a bridge to achieve justice. And I know in the reproductive justice, movement, we speak a lot around, the right to choose, but the fact that those rights are not just enough, because that choice has to be supported with literal access to services that are comprehensive, that are affirming of people's dignity. The fact that we have to push back on criminalization, for example, of adolescent health, criminalization of same-sex relationships, for example, and how in every spheres of our lives, whether you are working in environment, in financial services sector, whether you are working in grant making, regardless of where you are positioned in society, it's everyone's business that we all have to thrive. It's everyone's business that we get environmental justice, economic justice, reproductive and sexuality justice. And that can only really happen if we have a common mission. And I think human rights, it's that common thread that all of us can really, support, because human rights are non-negotiable. Human rights are for everyone just by being human, and that regardless of what your vulnerability is or what situation you are in, that those in power should be able to protect and promote, your rights as a human to vulnerability, but also to dignity. So that I think the message important that it goes beyond just the global community of even what we call ourselves as human rights defenders, that we need to infuse this thinking in every sector of society so that we're all moving together on all levels, in all spheres, to achieve the common goal of promoting and protecting human rights, so that we are all thriving and not just stuck in survival, that we actually demand to thrive and not just survive. Thank you, Dipika.
Pooja, yours. And then Dominique.
Yeah, thank you, Dipika. And I do have to say, it's such a privilege to be amongst all this group of women, and I could spend all day listening to all of you. And I'm going to shamelessly use the opportunity Dipika gave me to ask the question and say, very shamelessly, and say one of the questions we constantly grapple with within ourselves is when a system is, as Dominique was saying, so fundamentally seems to be flawed, is what should be the ways in which people who should approach the system, right? And how do we then look at accountability truly, individually and systemic, to people? And I think that's like one of the fundamental questions we grapple with, which I would love to hear more from all of you. Yeah, thanks. Yeah,
and if I can just sorry, if I could sort of piggyback on that as well. I think that, Pooja, that question is really, do we ditch the system? Is the system incapable of offering what it claims to offer? And must we sort of ditch the master's tools? Or can it be what now? Can it be reclaimed, fully reclaimed? Can it be made to deliver a little bit of justice? And then we look for real justice somewhere else. So what, if we work within the system, what must our conceptual and practical strategies be? And then what are we expecting? I know Vereen has a thought. And Dominique, I don't know if you wanted to go before that. Dominique, and then
okay, yeah. I would actually meant to address this in my piece, and then got distracted, I guess, by my own voice. I think, so I'm a big fan of fighting in all the places. I think many systems are broken, that they are likely broken irrevocably, but actually it is possible to do some good in lots of spaces. I think when I was talking earlier about individual decision-making, about the subjective decision-making of people with power, I had sort of intended to mention that this is also true inside of our big bureaucracies like the UN and human rights systems, where individual accountability needs to be happening as well as institutional accountability. And so you'll meet many, many people who've been in these systems and come out saying, I can't get anything done, I'm sidelined, I'm delegitimized. But the reality is, if everybody was pushing those conversations, if everybody was creating some discomfort, right, it would be very difficult to avoid evolving these organizations. And so I think the reality is, and the truth of our lives, because of the massive concentration of power and resources in certain spaces, right? If you didn't have this massive power dynamic, it might be a little bit different, is that we do need to fight in all the spaces. We need to fight on the outside, we need to fight on the inside, but there is a real, I think, imperative to also understand how important it is to intervene constantly with people who do have decision-making authority at every level, and to really push those conversations. I was going to add a question, but maybe not, or should I wait?
I don't see why not. Is it related? Do you want to wait until?
As you like. It's not totally related. I mean, it's all a little related. But
okay, so let me come back.
Go ahead. I'll wait.
Yeah, Verena, over to you.
Thank you. I've learned so much from listening to my fellow panelists. It's just amazing, and I have to reiterate my thanks to the organizers for having put this forum together. But as I was listening to Dr. T, the question came to me about the psychological harm that is done really to people of African descent who have to undergo or have to suffer the consequences of some of these medical decisions and some of these medical practices. And I know Pooja spoke about the case of Caster Semenya. And I thought about psychological rehabilitation, which is a large part of the reparatory justice project of CARICOM. And how does that translate into the area of sport, where I don't think people talk a lot about. We talk about the case of Caster Semenya, but I don't think we talk generally about the psychological harm and the racism that some of these athletes sometimes have to face, and what can we do as human rights defenders to protect their interest. The other thing, Dr. T, you know, during this time of COVID-19, this pandemic, to me, if there's a kind of almost flippant acceptance of the fact that those who will die are those with comorbidities. And I've always been pushing back at this. Well, you know, it's okay because young people won't get it because they don't have comorbidities. And thank you for framing the roots, really, of some of those comorbidities. And those roots lie deep in colonialism. And in the case of the Caribbean, in the kind of diet that our ancestors were fed, you know, with so much salt and so on for so many 100 years. So I think we really require a detailed look at this discussion of comorbidity as if, well, there's no reason, you will die because you have a comorbidity, without focusing on the roots of comorbidity and the actions that we must take to ensure that the hypertension that you mentioned, you know, is not just seen as a lifestyle, the result of lifestyle choices, but lie deep within the roots of colonialism and racism. And the final thing I wanted to say, picking up on Dominique's extensive discussion, letting us get access to what happened at the HRC meeting when you tried to get this resolution to have more teeth. I mean, I kind of think about self-care for those of us who are working in the UN system. How do we feel when we are exposed and confronted these pushbacks for the causes we are fighting? And it brings me back to your important question. Do the UN systems work in the way they are supposed to work? And how do we feel as practitioners, people defending other, all groups, because that's what we're supposed to do. But how do we care for ourselves when the violence comes to us through the discussions at these various fora? These are just, things that occurred to me as I listened to everyone. Thank you.
Thanks. Dr. T, did you want to respond directly?
Yes, in fact, just to apologize to everyone, I've got another decolonization of health webinar due to start. But I just want to say that, in fact, you are quite right, Prof. Firstly, is that the issue of Caster Semenya, for example, and how other African countries have then gone on to ban their athletes from racing as a result of that ruling means that not only is it a discrimination in terms of race and gender in sport, but it's actually violence against women. And I know that there's a working group within the UN that's looking at this issue of race and gender in sport as really violence against women, but it's also economic violence. These women have a God-given talent or whatever they believe in, but the talent is there, they're born with it. And they are being hampered from actually making income and sustaining themselves with their talent. And being a sports person, you only have a certain window, right, to be a professional athlete. So this really speaks to the type of systemic and deep violence that some of these rulings that may seem not to have consequence. These are dire consequences for many of the African women. The other issues of nutrition, and it reminds me of how we have to think about maternal health care and newborn health care, for example, perhaps looking at extending that postpartum period and making it 4 terms, as opposed to 3 terms, so that we are intentional in assisting women and newborns in thriving, especially in those critical few weeks of life and months. But what's also important is the health of a person before they get pregnant in any case. I always, look with such disbelief when people ridicule that African athletes are short or the NBA athletes are so much taller and stronger. And I'm saying these are the literal consequences of colonialism and apartheid, where Black women's nutrition has always been poor, where the food that communities and marginalized populations are buying is not good, nutritious food of good, nutritious value. So when we are laughing at other people because they are short, it's actually laughing at the fact that we are laughing at poverty, right? We are laughing at the fact that stunted growth still disproportionately affects African poorer communities than other types of populations. And I think that's why elevating these conversations is so important. And again, within a human rights framework, because those are non-negotiables. We can talk about morals, judgment, we can talk about all sorts of culture, religion, but human rights is what connects all of us. And I think if all our solutions can be geared towards the restoration of dignity of all persons, I think we will further, get to where we need to quicker, and really not shy away from naming and calling the oppressive systems for what they are, whether it's racism, sexism, ableism, xenophobia, transphobia, all of those systems. We need to name them and ask for accountability, all the way from governments to philanthropists, which often set the agenda for global health, by the way, and whose behalf they speak of. And so it's just to thank everybody for this amazing discussion, and I look forward to drawing on all of your expertise and knowledge in my new role, going forward. So you can expect to hear from me very soon, and thank you very much. I will be leaving shortly. And thank you to SRI. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Dr. T. Well, Pooja said she wanted to stay all day and talk to people. We won't stay all day, and we are already over time, 5 minutes over time, but there are a few questions that people have written in, people who are listening have written in. Shall I just sort of throw 2 or 3 of them out, and we can use that as a way to sort of wrap up the conversation? Because we've ranged so much. I mean, all of you have ranged, there's been such a range of topics that have come up. For example, we haven't really touched on the question of resources, right? How does the work that we want to do get resourced? And that's come up in practically every presentation. The question of the individual versus the system, etc. So we won't get to everything, but let me read out some questions and perhaps particular particular panelists can respond to them, or all of you. One question is about how important education is for fighting racism, xenophobia. And I think the writer means formalized education, school and university, etc. So if someone has thoughts about that really quickly.
Can I just take a shot at that and just say it's a very simple answer. It is critical. Education is critical in breaking down stereotypes, in breaking down myths, in ensuring that we tell the children the truth, as Bob Marley always sings. So, but it is what is the content of the curriculum? And I think that is why the program of activities for the UN International Decade for People of African Descent speaks to. The program speaks to the necessity of decolonizing the curriculum to ensure that we break down what some of us taught. And one of the ways of righting the wrongs of the past is to decolonize the curriculum. So access is important, access to education at all levels, including tertiary level. But I think our responsibility as educators must also be to decolonize the curriculum and don't just fit children. And I was listening to Dominique about the experience in Belgium. Don't just fit children for what you stereotype as their station in life, but ensure that there's equality and equity in the education system, and more importantly, address the content so that people of African descent, children, stop feeling inferior because they're taught that their history started with enslavement. So that's what I would offer.
Maybe I can add just a few words to that, which is also to recognize how effectively education has been used to manipulate and erase the truths, the contributions, and the strengths of people of African descent. I was today years old when I learned Althea Gibson had to go through chromosomal testing once she won Wimbledon, right? We've seen this issue of the ways in the Caribbean and in the US, education has erased not just the racism, but also the innovation and the inventions of people of African descent that have directly built these countries. So I agree with everything Breen says, of course, and decolonizing, but then at the same time, we should be aware that education has been a massive tool of propaganda for white supremacy.
Right, yeah. Pooja, did you want to add something?
Yeah, just after we moved to Geneva, when we ended up asking people, particularly from the UK, what they learn about UK and its history of colonization, it wasn't much from what we learned. It wasn't a part of the school education system. And then the question is, who's setting the education? If you don't know the crimes of the past, then how do you recompense for it? So I think there is something about that, just to add that. Yeah.
Yeah.
Right, absolutely. And I think some of what you said also connects to the points that have come up already about, systems, inflexible, perhaps racist systems, but then individuals and the ability of individuals to be able to effect perhaps small change that can grow. And I think, Dominique, you made this point as well, which responds to one of the questions that someone asked as well, which was really about how do people who work in the system protect themselves, right? How do you do this work if you are a racialized and gendered person? Which I think, Breen, you spoke to that question as well. And it seems like what you're all pointing towards is also a need for solidarity, right? That actually folks doing this work need to do this much more collaboration, because the people maintaining the systems are definitely collaborating implicitly or explicitly in maintaining those systems. And there needs to be, even though energy on the ground might be low, and often is, without the collaboration, mutual support, this work mightn't actually go very far. There are a couple of questions related to what next. there was a Durban Declaration. How do we maintain the momentum of the work that's been done? One person's asked whether we need a new process that led to the similar to the process that led to the Durban Declaration, or can the Durban Declaration be, I don't know, operationalized, used? There's a question also about how work that's being done within the UN system can and should connect to work that's done outside the UN system, and in movements in different parts of the world. How do we use the commitments made in Durban and also in other international agreements, firstly to improve them and build upon them, the commitments, and then to translate them into actual change. There's also a question about caste. How do we, is there a way to use some of this work to deal with the question of caste in South Asia? And there's a specific question also about how the third committee is observing the brutality in the US, and taking a position against the racism that we're witnessing in the US. I'll just put a couple of other things out as well, and leave the floor over to you then. Another question is about how, lots of countries have good policies. So there's a question about implementation, right? Good policies and laws in place, but the implementation becomes a problem. So what can we do to press our governments to implement policy and law? The last question I want to throw out is, there's a question that's asking the panelists whether all of you have any connection with Afro women in Guatemala and Honduras who've been subjected to discrimination and who are affected by the pandemic, just like the poorest and most of the working women in the world. I know that's a lot, so perhaps, whatever threads you can draw across from you.
I can start if you want. So in terms of what the UN, I'll start sort of toward the beginning of those questions. In terms of Durban, the Durban Declaration, what the UN systems are thinking about and doing, we're at the 20th anniversary, or about at the 20th anniversary of the Durban Declaration, and there's definitely a big push inside the human rights spaces to not just commemorate this, but to take stock of where we are. There's an active conversation about the creation, more than a conversation, there's an active resolution about the creation of a permanent forum on people of African descent that we're very hopeful will move forward this session. It seems to have stalled last November. And there's we're at the midpoint of the International Decade for People of African Descent, as Varun has mentioned, which has been a moment to really focus on the ways in which our disregard of race and racism has actually enabled ongoing discrimination, ongoing oppression, ongoing inequality, ongoing inequity. And so these are conversations happening inside the UN space, but to draw on your sort of second question, I think they also reflect the importance of civil society, the importance of movements and people and communities outside of UN spaces, loudly and clearly articulating their goals, their concerns, and their frustrations, and their expectations of all bureaucracies and of all people working within them or next to them. We sort of work next to them, we're not employed by the UN. There is no actual forward movement without the truths and the stories of people on the ground in terms of how they experience their human rights and how this racialized concern, these intersectional racialized concerns manifest, because those aren't the conversations that are happening internally in Geneva, right? Those aren't conversations that are visible to people in Palais Wilson in Geneva. So there is nothing more important in my mind than the conversations that are happening and the work that is happening in people's local contexts. We do have a communications procedure, so we do hear from civil society in certain countries. I don't actually think we received anything from Guatemala or Honduras, although I did have a conversation with somebody in Honduras in the last several months. But we do collect information. I think, as you all know, we're not paid for this work. It's quite a lot of work, and so we're constantly trying to catch up. But these are important spaces to intervene, and we do report out on them. So maybe I will leave it there.
Reem, over to you.
Okay, unmute. So thank you for framing those questions, sending them our way, and I'll be very quick. And I'll just focus on those that seem to implicate CERD. So first of all, the CERD has not been blind to what has been going on in the United States of America and in this global Black Lives Matter campaign. And so we have issued, we joined with other special procedures and treaty bodies that issued a statement on this situation. And then we issued our own statement so people can research that. And our latest statement actually is on the impact of COVID-19 on the intensification of racist actions and the impact of that, the ways in which there's inequality and inequity in how people can actually, survive COVID-19 and so on. So there's a statement just issued today on COVID-19. So we haven't been, blind to what is going on. We also drafted a letter to the High Commissioner expressing just concern and awareness of the discussions around Woodrow Wilson and Palais Wilson. Then I want to say to the sisters in Guatemala and Honduras, please use the ICERD and the CERD, because there is something called individual communication, and that can be used to bring attention to the issues there. Now remember, CERD, we're not CEDAW as we always say, but there's the issue of intersectionality. And so once the complaint is about that, then there is a working group that pays attention to that. Yes, the issue of implementation is very important. We issue concluding observations. We call on states to do this or that. Implementation is an issue. However, I agree with Dominique. Civil society needs to align itself to a much greater extent with the treaty bodies, because, and IMADR is doing a wonderful job where that is concerned. We need civil society and human rights defenders on the ground in the countries to call states accountable to implement the concluding observations that we issue. The issue of the Dalits, and the issue of caste, that is something that comes up in the CERD a lot. And finally, in terms of what next, I think that we just have to keep holding states accountable for any of these violations that we believe affect the human rights of all people, and really don't drop the ball in terms of our activism. Specifically though, there are two recommendations that have been made. There's a call for a summit to discuss reparation involving those colonial powers who are implicated. That has been issued by CARICOM, the CARICOM Reparation Commission. And then there's a call for UN Commission on Reparation, a kind of, I don't know, world conference, and another world conference on this, or not a world, maybe some people are calling for a world conference, another world conference, but following up on Durban, but also some people are calling for a UN Commission on Reparation, and we'll see where that goes.
Thank you. Pooja, did you want to add something?
Yeah. Just quickly, I think the question of social movements, at least coming from the Human Rights Council, where the Sexual Rights Initiative, which is a coalition of 6 organizations where we're in, we think the UN should align, especially the multilateral bodies, should align to the movements better, because a lot of the conversation that happens there isn't new. It's been happening, as both Dominique and we have constantly, it's happened forever. I think the UN is way far beyond. And the question should be, how can the UN be of the people rather than how the people should listen to the UN? As naive as that sounds, how can we make the UN of the people should, for us, is the real question. And to add the question, and I think it's a very similar way on how Dalit Bahujan movements have been working in South Asia, and the South Asian government's denial of that is pretty much almost the same as the Western government's denial of white supremacy. So I think the movements have been working. It is connection with the movement. For us, that is where, as a coalition of organizations who do represent civil society, that is where I think the role of people who engage with the UN is to make that align more better. Thanks.
And I agree with you that it's the UN that must listen to the people. But how that will work is that the groups, when countries come before the CERD, for example, the groups on the ground in these countries must ensure that they make us know what's happening on the ground. And in many cases, it's not, civil society is not active the same way in all countries. And so, you know, my appeal would be to ensure that on the ground, there are groups that we can link with so that we have a balanced view of what's going on and what the demands are and the needs are.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. We're way over time, so I think we do need to stop. I'd like to first say thanks. I'd like to apologize again for the technical difficulties and the trouble with interpretation. SRI will upload the entire video on its YouTube channel, so for folks who might have missed it. Finally, thanks to everyone who is watching, was watching, who tuned in, but most of all, thanks so much to all the wonderful panelists for the amazingly detailed, nuanced clarity on both concepts, on both ways of thinking and ways of doing. And the number of issues that you've raised here is, I think, has really sort of been very, very edifying, certainly for me, and I'm sure for others. So thank you again so very much for making the time. Thank you so very much for staying a little bit over the time limit. Thank you so very much for all the work that you do, including Dr. T, who had to leave early, well, on time. And I'm sure that these conversations will continue in other spaces. And thanks again.
Thank you. And thanks to SRI. This is a really special event.
Thank you, Dipika, as well, for the lovely moderation.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you for the opportunity. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Thanks.